The sea arrived without warning, not as a wave, not as something you could see coming from the shore and brace yourself against. It arrived as a sound, a low, massive roar rising out of total darkness from the south. And by the time the people sleeping in their homes on the islands of the Ganges Delta understood what they were hearing, the water was already through the walls. It was after 11 o'clock at night on November the 12th, 1970. The cyclone had been tracking north through the Bay of Bengal for days. Meteorologists in Dhaka had watched it form, had tracked its strengthening, had issued warnings. Radio Pakistan had broadcast those warnings. And yet, on the flat tidal islands of East Pakistan, some of the most densely populated land on the surface of the earth, almost no one moved. The water came in at somewhere between 6 and 10 meters high. In the Thana of Tazumuddin, on Bhola Island, the surge rose 6 meters in minutes. Homes built from mud and bamboo, the only kind most families could afford, dissolved within seconds. Trees that had stood for 40 years came down. People who had tied themselves to trunks were dragged under by the force of the current or crushed by debris sweeping through at the speed of a vehicle. By the time the surge retreated, the southern half of Bhola Island had been erased, not damaged, not flooded, erased. Hatia Island, Kutubdia, Sandwip, 13 islands near Chittagong. Pakistani radio would later report that on those 13 islands, there were no survivors. Not fewer survivors. None. Before dawn, the bodies were in the trees. This was the Bhola Cyclone of 1970. It remains, more than 50 years later, the deadliest tropical cyclone in recorded history. Between 300,000 and 500,000 people died in a single night. More people than are killed in most wars, more than live in most major cities. And the most haunting fact of all is this: the storm was detected, the danger was known, the warnings were sent. Almost no one was ready. Before this story goes any further, like this video and subscribe to Epicenter Files. Stories this important deserve to be seen. Now, back to 1970. How does something like this happen? How does a cyclone kill 500,000 people in one night? When meteorologists have been tracking it for days, when warnings have been broadcast across the radio, when the technology exists to see the danger coming? The answer is not simple. It is not the story of one bureaucrat's negligence or one broken radio tower. It is the story of a warning that worked perfectly at the top of the system and collapsed completely before it reached the people who needed it most. It is the story of a population living on some of the most storm-exposed land on Earth, with nowhere to go and no reliable way to know they needed to go somewhere. And it is the story of a government based 1,000 miles away in West Pakistan that watched what happened and, in the weeks that followed, responded in a way that would prove almost as consequential as the cyclone itself. To understand all of that, we have to rewind. The Ganges Delta is one of the great wonders of the natural world. Formed over millions of years by the converging flows of the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna rivers, it is the largest river delta on Earth. Hundreds of rivers and channels thread through it, constantly moving, constantly shifting, constantly depositing new sediment from the interior of the continent. From above, it looks less like solid land than like a living organism, a vast, braided network of waterways, islands, and impossibly flat plains stretching to the horizon in every direction. For thousands of years, this fertility has drawn people. The soil of the delta is among the richest anywhere in the world. Rice grows with ease. Fish fill every channel. The land offers almost everything a community needs to survive and thrive. And so the delta filled, slowly at first, then faster still, until by the middle of the 20th century, the tidal islands of East Pakistan were among the most densely populated places on the surface of the planet. Bhola Island, the largest island in the delta, was home to more than 1.5 million people. Hatia Island, Sandwip, Kutubdia. These were not empty fishing outposts at the edge of the sea. They were full, functioning communities, rice farmers, fishermen, markets, schools, families who had lived on this land for generations. The sea was not something distant or foreign. It was the defining fact of daily life. And the Bay of Bengal, which forms the southern boundary of this world, is warm, shallow, and shaped like a funnel. Those three qualities make it the most active cyclone basin on the planet. Roughly 80% of all tropical cyclone deaths worldwide have historically occurred in the Bay of Bengal region. The people of the Delta had always lived with this reality. Cyclones were not new. They were a recurring feature of life here, as certain as the monsoon, as familiar as the tide itself. But familiarity had bred a particular kind of resignation, and a dangerous one. The Delta floods regularly. The Delta storms regularly. Communities rebuilt, replanted, returned. There was almost nowhere to evacuate to. Most of the islands sat less than a meter above sea level at their highest points. In 1970, there were just 44 rudimentary cyclone shelters in the entire country, in a coastal zone holding tens of millions of people. The culture that had developed around cyclone risk was therefore not a culture of evacuation. It was a culture of endurance. You tied down what you could. You held on to what you could. You waited. That calculation had worked before. In November of 1970, it failed catastrophically. By November, the worst of the Bay of Bengal's cyclone season was typically considered to be winding down. The most dangerous months were generally the spring and early summer. November storms were rarer, and the general expectation among coastal communities, and, critically, among the institutions responsible for their safety, was that the main season had passed. Warnings had been issued in previous years that had not materialized into serious events. That history quietly eroded the credibility of any given alert. There was also a structural problem that went far deeper than calendar assumptions. East Pakistan, the eastern wing of a nation divided from its own government by more than 1,000 miles of Indian territory, had long experienced a complicated and adversarial relationship with the central administration in West Pakistan. Rawalpindi and Islamabad held political and military power. East Pakistan held more than half the country's total population. Resources, infrastructure, institutional attention, these flowed disproportionately westward. The meteorological and communications infrastructure available to East Pakistan reflected this imbalance directly. Weather stations were insufficient in number and frequently in poor repair. The systems that were supposed to translate a meteorological warning into a coordinated ground-level response were fragmented, underfunded, and in some coastal areas simply absent. Pakistan's Flood Action Plan, the framework that should have governed disaster preparedness and response, had known structural flaws. Disaster funds were misallocated, and early warnings routinely failed to reach the coastal residents who most needed them. This was the environment into which a strengthening cyclone was moving on the night of November the 12th. The Pakistan Meteorological Department was watching the Bhola Cyclone form and strengthen. The danger was not hidden from forecasters. A formal danger preparedness report was issued on November the 12th, the day of landfall, calling on coastal residents to take precautions. Radio Pakistan broadcast the warnings. At the technical level, the warning system functioned. What happened between that broadcast and the coastal population of the Ganges Delta was where everything broke down. Radio Pakistan had historically used a recognized, traditional method of announcing cyclone danger through its broadcasts, a specific style of alert that coastal communities had come to associate with genuine and serious risk. According to reporting at the time by Pakistan Press International, that traditional announcement method had been discontinued. The new warning, when it was broadcast, did not carry the signal that generations of coastal listeners had been conditioned to recognize as a true emergency. Many residents of the Delta Islands had no radio access at all. The islands were poor. Infrastructure was limited. In many communities, the only information that reached people came through neighbors or local officials. If a local official did not receive the warning clearly, did not understand its severity, or had no mechanism to act on it, the information stopped there. It went no further. And even among those who received some version of the warning, the same impossible question confronted everyone. Go where? There were no cyclone shelters. There was no elevated ground. There was no coordinated evacuation plan, no designated routes, no official system for moving people off the islands before a storm arrived. For most families living on the Bhola coastal zone, The instruction to evacuate was a directive without a destination, so most people stayed. They stayed in homes that were never built to survive what was coming. The cyclone, meanwhile, was not waiting. The Bhola Cyclone had originated from the remnants of Tropical Storm Nora, which had formed in the South China Sea in early November, crossed the Malay Peninsula, re-entered the Bay of Bengal, and reorganized in the warm waters to the south. By approximately November the 8th, it had structured itself into a formal tropical cyclone and begun drifting slowly northward. For several days, it built. By November the 11th, it had reached peak intensity. Sustained winds had grown to approximately 185 kilometers per hour, with gusts significantly higher. Its central pressure had dropped to 960 hectopascals. It was large, organized, and accelerating toward the north-northeast, directly toward the Ganges Delta. The Bay of Bengal was working against the people of East Pakistan in multiple ways simultaneously. First, the bay is shallow. Shallow water amplifies storm surges dramatically. As a cyclone drives water ahead of it, a deep ocean basin absorbs some of that energy downward. A shallow basin cannot. The water has nowhere to go but forward and up. Second, the bay narrows toward the north. As the storm surge moved northward, the funnel geometry of the coastline compressed it. Water that had spread across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean was being squeezed into an increasingly confined space, forced higher and higher as it approached land. Third, and most devastating of all, the cyclone made landfall during a full moon, at approximately the same time as the local high tide. A full moon amplifies tidal height. High tide means the ocean surface is already elevated before the surge arrives. Into this already raised sea, the Bhola cyclone drove a storm surge of approximately 10 meters, more than 30 feet of water, ahead of it as it struck the coast. No single factor caused what was about to happen. The surge, the tide, the full moon, the shallow funnel-shaped bay, the flat islands with nowhere to run. Each element compounded the others. Together they produced something that almost nothing on those islands could have survived. And then there was the darkness. The surge arrived at night, around 11 o'clock in the evening. No one could see it coming, only hear it, a sound survivors would later describe as a roaring from the south, unlike anything they had experienced. By the time that sound registered as danger, the water was already moving through the walls. What happened over the next several hours is not fully documented, because in many areas there was almost no one left to document it. In the Thana of Tazumuddin, on the eastern side of Bhola Island, the surge struck with particular violence. Water rose, approximately 6 meters, in a matter of minutes. Not standing water, not slow flooding, moving water, carrying with it the wreckage of every structure it had already destroyed upstream. Entire rows of homes, built from mud and bamboo, dissolved under the force. The people inside them had no warning they could act on before the walls gave way. People who survived described clinging to trees through the surge and the wind and the debris field the water carried. They held on through the darkness, through the noise, through the force of the water tearing at them for minutes that felt like hours. Survivors were found afterward with deep abrasions across their arms, their chests, and their legs, the marks of holding on with everything they had. For those who were asleep when the surge arrived, there was almost no chance. The mortality rate in Tazumuddin was later officially recorded at 46.3%. Nearly half the population of that area died in a single night. Somewhere between 77,000 and 80,000 people in one administrative district in the hours between dusk and dawn. The southern half of Bhola Island was, by morning, largely gone. On the 13 islands near Chittagong, Pakistani radio reported no survivors. Aerial surveys confirmed what those words meant. Communities that had existed on the morning of November the 12th did not exist on the morning of November the 13th. Across the entire affected zone, the regional average mortality was approximately 16.5%, roughly 1 in 6 people across all impacted areas. In the worst-hit locations, the numbers were far higher than that average suggests. More than half of all the dead were children under the age of 10. By morning, bodies were everywhere. In the trees, in the remaining channels, wherever the surge had retreated, along what was left of the shoreline. In the fields where the rice crop, the harvest that would have carried communities through the winter, had been standing the day before. The rice was gone. The crop, the cattle, the boats, the homes, gone. 280,000 cattle were dead. 46,000 of the Delta's 77,000 onshore fishermen had been killed in a single night. 9,000 offshore fishing boats were destroyed. 65% of the entire fishing industry's capacity had ceased to exist overnight. Approximately 85% of the housing in the impact zone was destroyed or severely damaged. 3.5 million people were directly affected. The true scale of what had happened took days to reach the outside world, incompletely, in accounts that many found impossible to accept. The first official statements from East Pakistan's administration placed the death toll at 16,000. United States officials, working from their own assessments, estimated a minimum of 300,000. The gap between those two numbers is itself a kind of evidence. Medical relief teams, who eventually reached the affected areas, conducted surveys, concluding a minimum of 224,000 deaths. Later analysis, accounting for areas where data collection was simply not possible because there was no one left to count, produced estimates ranging up to 500,000. No one knows the precise number. The uncertainty is its own testimony. In some areas, there were not enough survivors to record who had been there before. The World Meteorological Organization formally declared the Bhola Cyclone the deadliest tropical cyclone in recorded history. That record has not been broken. When the Bhola Cyclone struck East Pakistan on the evening of November the 12th, President General Yahya Khan was on a state visit to China. He returned to Dhaka on November the 14th. He stayed for 2 days. Then, he left. The relief operation that followed was, by the central government's own account, serious and adequate. By nearly every other account, from East Pakistani political leaders, from international observers, from journalists who reached the affected areas, it was a profound failure. The initial military assets deployed were 3 gunboats, 1 hospital ship, 1 military transport aircraft, and 3 crop dusting aircraft. A company that offered additional aircraft was made to wait 2 days for official permission to use them. A single helicopter was initially deployed, despite the government's stated inability to transfer more from the Western Wing. India offered helicopter transport assistance. The central government refused, rerouting Indian relief supplies by road instead, costing critical days. The United States Peace Corps offered volunteers. The central government declined. Meanwhile, international assistance was arriving in volume. The United Kingdom deployed a Royal Navy task force, including the vessels HMS Intrepid and HMS Triumph, with 8 helicopters and 8 landing craft. The Disasters Emergency Committee in Britain raised £1.5 million through public appeal. The United States contributed an initial grant of $10 million and eventually shipped approximately 200,000 tons of wheat. Canada contributed $2 million Canadian dollars. Singapore sent a medical mission that arrived December the 1st and treated nearly 27,000 patients. The United Nations deployed resources, and UNICEF repaired more than 11,000 wells. The World Bank extended $25 million in reconstruction credit. The international response, substantial as it was, came from abroad. The government of Pakistan, the government actually responsible for the people who had just died, was outpaced by foreign nations in reaching its own citizens. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, leader of the Awami League and the most prominent political voice in East Pakistan, did not mince words. He described the central government's response as criminal negligence and unpardonable apathy. He noted, pointedly, that the volume of assistance flowing from foreign governments was the clearest possible measure of how completely the government of Pakistan had abandoned its own people in the East. Yahya Khan's government rejected the allegations entirely and publicly accused East Pakistani political leaders of exaggerating the devastation for political advantage. General elections were scheduled for December the 7th. They proceeded. The December elections of 1970 were supposed to be a moment of democratic transition. Pakistan's first genuine general elections since independence. A promised shift from military governance toward civilian rule. What they became, in the weeks after Bhola, was something different entirely. In the Delta communities most devastated by the cyclone, and particularly in the districts that had received the least relief from the central government, support for the Awami League went beyond even prior projections. Academic research published decades later confirmed the pattern with statistical precision. The less government relief a district received, the more dramatically its vote for the Awami League increased. The Awami League won 160 of 162 contested seats in East Pakistan's allocation of the National Assembly. It secured a majority in the National Assembly overall, enough, in theory, to form the government of Pakistan. The West Pakistan military government refused to transfer power. In March of 1971, the Pakistani military launched a crackdown on East Pakistan. 9 months of war followed. Indian military intervention came in December of 1971. Bangladesh emerged as an independent nation. The Bhola Cyclone did not create the conditions that led to the Bangladesh Liberation War by itself. The political marginalization of East Pakistan ran deep. 2 decades of economic exploitation, cultural suppression, and democratic denial had built the underlying pressure long before November of 1970. But the cyclone stripped away whatever remained of the pretense that the government based in West Pakistan considered the survival of East Pakistani people its responsibility. In the wreckage of Tazimuddin, in the 13 islands with no survivors, in the silence where communities had stood, the argument for Bangladesh became something no election result could contain. To fully understand why the Bhola cyclone was as deadly as it was, it helps to understand the physics of what a storm surge actually is. A tropical cyclone does not kill primarily through wind. The deadliest element of a major cyclone striking a flat coastal zone is the storm surge, the enormous dome of water that the storm drives ahead of it as it approaches land. A powerful cyclone acts on the ocean's surface in 2 ways simultaneously. First, its extremely low central atmospheric pressure reduces the weight of air pressing down on the water beneath it, allowing the sea to physically rise, sometimes by a meter or more, directly under the storm's core. Second, the rotating wind field of the cyclone pushes enormous volumes of water forward, piling it ahead of the storm's leading edge as it moves toward shore. When that moving wall of water meets a shallow, funnel-shaped coastline like the northern Bay of Bengal, it has nowhere to go but upward and forward. It amplifies as it enters shallower water. It compresses as the narrowing coastline squeezes it laterally. It accelerates as land draws it in. When it encounters a landscape that sits barely above sea level, islands where the highest point is measured in centimeters rather than meters, where there are no barriers, no shelters, no higher ground to reach, the result is total inundation. The full moon on November the 12th elevated the astronomical tide near its maximum. The storm surge did not arrive against a baseline ocean. It arrived against an ocean already pushed toward its upper range by the tidal cycle. The 3 forces, surge, tide, and lunar amplification, combined into something the delta's geography could not survive, regardless of what any human institution had or had not done. But human institutions still could have made the difference between 500,000 dead and 50,000 dead. They did not. The international response to the Bhola cyclone eventually arrived in significant scale. The Royal Navy Task Force, the American wheat shipments, the United Nations resources, the Singapore medical teams. They addressed the immediate emergency. They did not address what had made the emergency possible. That response came from Bangladesh itself. The Cyclone Preparedness Program was established in 1972, the year following Bangladeshi independence, by the Bangladesh Red Cross Society in cooperation with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. It was built specifically on the lessons of Bhola, on the question of how a warning that is technically transmitted can still fail to reach the people it was meant to protect. The answer it found was not primarily technological. It was human. The program deployed trained community volunteers, local people, from the villages and islands themselves, to serve as the final link in the warning chain. When a cyclone warning was issued, these volunteers moved door to door, sounded handheld sirens, waved warning flags, and physically reached the households that no radio broadcast could reach. They knew their neighbors. They knew who needed help to move. They were not distant institutions transmitting signals into the void. They were present, trusted, local. Elevated concrete cyclone shelters, structures engineered to remain structurally sound, even partially submerged, capable of holding hundreds of people above the surge line, were built across the coastal zone over the following decades. In 1970, there had been 44 rudimentary shelters in the entire country. By the early 1990s, the network had grown dramatically. On April the 29th, 1991, Cyclone Gorky struck Bangladesh. Its winds reached approximately 260 kilometers per hour, faster than the Bhola Cyclone. It drove a massive storm surge into the same low-lying coast. More than 350,000 people had been evacuated into shelters in advance. The death toll was approximately 138,000. That number is a catastrophe. But set against 300,000 to 500,000 in 1970, it is also a measurement of what deliberate, sustained, community-centered investment in warning infrastructure can accomplish. At the international institutional level, the World Meteorological Organization had responded to Bhola by formally initiating its tropical cyclone program at its 6th Congress in 1971. The Bhola disaster directly accelerated global investment in storm surge forecasting, satellite-based cyclone tracking, and the formalization of coastal warning systems across the most vulnerable regions of the world. And in 1971, former Beatle George Harrison and the sitarist Ravi Shankar organized the Concert for Bangladesh, the first major humanitarian benefit concert in history, raising funds for Bangladeshi refugees from both the cyclone's aftermath and the Liberation War. The model they created that year would be followed by relief efforts for decades to come. The Bhola Cyclone appears in the historical record primarily as a number: 300,000, 500,000. The deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded. But its actual legacy is more complicated than a death toll. It is the story of a warning system that functioned at the technical level and collapsed at the human level, and of what that distinction costs when the stakes are existential. It is the story of a government that held the responsibility to protect its people and chose, in the most critical moment, not to treat that responsibility as real, and of the political consequences of that choice, which ultimately reshaped a nation and a region. It is the story of a country that was born partly from the wreckage of a cyclone and then spent 50 years building, one shelter and one trained volunteer at a time, one of the most effective community-based disaster response systems anywhere in the world, because it understood, from the most brutal possible education, what happens when that system does not exist. Bangladesh today has more than 76,000 trained cyclone preparedness volunteers deployed across thousands of coastal villages. It has more than 3,000 elevated concrete cyclone shelters along its coast. It has a multi-tier early warning system capable of moving a storm alert from a satellite tracking a cyclone over the Bay of Bengal to a volunteer sounding a siren in a tidal island village within hours. When Cyclone Cedar struck in 2007, an advance warning was issued more than 48 hours before landfall. More than 3 million people were evacuated. The surge, which reached approximately 5 meters in height, killed approximately 3,500 people. 3,500. Not 500,000. That difference is not fortune. It is not a kinder storm. It is 50 years of deliberate, unglamorous, undramatic work. Shelters built, volunteers trained, warning systems tested season after season, community trust earned slowly across the same islands where the water once arrived without warning in the dark. But the warning that Bhola carries into the present is not for Bangladesh alone. Every low-lying coastal delta on Earth, across Southeast Asia, West Africa, the Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific Islands, sits on the same fundamental problem that confronted East Pakistan on November the 12th, 1970. A warning system is only as powerful as its final link. Early warning data is only as valuable as the infrastructure that converts it into human movement. A forecast that reaches a capital city and stops there is not a working system. It is the appearance of one. As sea levels rise, the baseline against which every future storm surge will be measured rises with them. The funnel of the Bay of Bengal will fill a little higher. The surge will travel a little further inland. The margin between a good warning and a catastrophic outcome will narrow with every degree of warming and every centimeter of sea level rise. Bhola taught the world something that the world is still, in places, working to fully absorb. A storm is a storm. What determines how many people survive it is not the storm itself. It is everything that was built, or not built, before it arrived. And the warning has to reach the last person, on the last island, in the dark.